I'm really fortunate to be able to make this presentation to y'all free of charge through family development. We in Extension have a mission of trying to, bring the knowledge that we generate at the university out to the broader community, to everybody across the state, including those in Houston County. So just want to say hello to everybody here. And if you get a chance in the chat to type in either did you grow up in a small town? Do you currently work or live in a small town? Tell us a little bit about yourself, put where you're from or where you are. If you don't mind. So my kind of presentation here is called Rewriting the Rural Narrative. The premise behind all my life's work has been that the narrative we're using to describe our small towns is terrible. A lot of times it's based out of things that happened 100 years ago or 50 years ago, and really doesn't reflect, I would argue, where we are today. So you see the subtitle here is Speak Softly and Carry Statistics. I'm a data geek. I love data, but I know many people don't. So hopefully everything you hear today and see today will be consumable and understandable. And we're going to try this a little bit different. You see my picture in the bottom corner here. I know a lot of times when we do Zoom presentation, it's really antiseptic and it's like some disembodied voice off somewhere. So we've got a way to do this. You can say hi and you can see me actually talking to you here today. So it's really a great feature that we've got. So I do have this kind of narrative that we talk about. And it's built on things in my industry. We've got academics, we've got people who study rural areas, and what do they look at? We talk about like what types of books and what types of articles get generated describing who we are and what's happening in rural America. And you see things like the slow agonizing death of the U.S. small town, or survival of rural America, fighting for the American countryside, hollowing out the middle. Like all of these are pretty terrible, not real, rejuvenating, I guess. Survival sounds like we're barely making it, right? And there's a book here that I will pick on a little bit called Hollowing Out the Middle. And this is called, the subtitle here is around the rural brain drain. And if you don't know, the rural brain drain is when your high school kids graduate and leave. And a lot of times, they call this the brain drain when our kids take off. But I would argue, let them go. That's not a uniquely rural thing. People have been doing this for decades. And really, what we want to talk about is the narrative of people who are kind of moving in. So we'll look at some of these other narratives that we got here too. But overall, though, it's, these are the common terminologies you see in journal articles or newspaper articles. This narrative, there's a brain drain, like the lucky few escape. Again, like look at the implication of that book title, even like hollowing out the middle. The implication here is that when you lose your 18-year-olds, that there's nobody left. You're just hollowing out your town and all you have are the old people left and the lucky few escape. So we've got all this terminology that truly is in our back pocket around negative narrative. So you see things like we live in the middle of nowhere. Anyway, which doesn't sound good, right? We're a sleepy town. You see this, you see these ones especially. We're a sleepy town. Everybody knows one another and nobody locks their doors. These are favorites that end up in newspaper articles that talk about a small, quaint town that was woken up by the tornado, as if everybody in town was doing nothing until the tornado hit and all of a sudden people woke up to the reality of the world they're living in. It's ridiculous. So anyway, Kellogg Foundation looks at these perceptions of rural and they'll tell you that whenever you see quotes like this in an article, like that's not the sign of a reporter that's done their job. That's a sign of a reporter that's relying upon stereotypes to describe what's going on in their town. And really, so it becomes interesting to look at how this narrative shapes rural America and how we talk about that today. And a lot of times this narrative is based upon what we had, like where our old storefronts, what we don't have, like what we wish we had. Like, I wish we had a pool. Our neighbor 6 miles down the road does. Maybe we should too. Or, what we could have had. So we have a lot of narratives across our communities talking about where we are today, but a lot of times it's based on anecdotes. So I want to introduce a term to you called anecdata, which is information which is presented as if it's based on serious research, but in fact it's based on what somebody thinks is true. I'm trying to fight this anecdata out there. So essentially, like everything you hear today will be citable. I've got a book, I've got a journal article behind it. So if you're interested in diving deeper into any one of these topics that we're going to kind of overview on here today, let me know. And we could do that. So this negative narrative is built upon things that really happened. Like, right, we mechanized agriculture, consolidated our farms. The 40s, 50s, and 60s saw a huge outmigration of people from rural America, because honestly, in the 10s and the 20s and 30s, as we started to mechanize agriculture, you all, 4 kids can't all get a job on the farm. Now you've got one of the kids that's got an opportunity on the farm, and the other 3 migrate off to the urban areas. So you started to see our rural populations go down during this early 1900 time period, at the very same time, roads and transportation systems kicked in. And what I mean is not even the interstate highway system. I mean, that wasn't brought in until the early 60s. I'm talking about the very first roads, and these roads connected one town to another. And really, this transformed how our towns saw themselves, how they saw their neighbors. You could get from one town to another in a day. This was transformative in our rural landscape, and we started to see the rise in Minnesota anyway, and a number of other states, of regional centers. And that is where we started to see centers of commerce. You started to see some of these smaller businesses close in the very small towns, and those jobs essentially shifted to those more urbanized regional centers. And I'm not talking 150,000 people regional centers. I'm talking about 5,000 people, right? 85% of all the cities in Minnesota are smaller than 5,000 people. And so we do have these regional centers across our landscape here. And this kind of transformation is, I call it Main Street restructuring here, right above here. Main Street restructuring, 40s, 50s, and 60s, a lot of businesses closed. And this is a really kind economist way of saying businesses closed, restructuring, right? But you essentially lost jobs, you lost businesses, hardware stores, grocery stores, apothecaries, 4 gas stations, and now down to 1, right? So meanwhile, you drive up and down Main Street, like here's a picture of Sleepy Eye right above me here. And I think this is that kind of Norman Rockwell-ish view of what people expect to find in a small town, but you don't find that today. You don't find main streets with, cars everywhere and people walking up and down the streets. Like we lived in Hancock for a number of years, and literally a week after I moved into town, the grocery store closed. And it's really easy. It is really easy to think then that our best days are behind us. That when I drove down Main Street and there's the closed up grocery store, and that's where the bank used to be. We had a boarded up bank building too. And it's easy to let your visuals make you believe that your town is dying. So this restructuring went through everywhere. I would argue that this is not a uniquely rural thing. But when I do talk to communities about that lost their grocery store, kind of the narrative is like, we should have shopped here more. And my point is that wouldn't have changed it. When we're closing a massive number of grocery stores, a massive number of hardware stores, that's not your trait. That's a trait called globalization, and that's impacting everyone. What differentiates one town from another is how you respond to that. How do you respond to these dramatic changes that have happened across our rural communities? And then in the 80s and 90s, right when I started to get my feet wet doing rural development work here in Minnesota, schools started consolidating, right? It was like, you used to each have your own K-12 school, and now one community got the K through 6 and the other got the high school, and now they had to change the name or whatever, right? Or sometimes you closed all the buildings and opened up a school in the middle of the countryside. Minnewaska area, Lac Parle did this. So we've got a number of districts that just look different, and there was a lot of hand wringing at the time. If it wasn't for open enrollment, or if it wasn't for private schools, like none of those were matter. Really, the number one predictor of school consolidation is your school enrollment, and that is declining due to the birth rate. Now that is actually something you have control over, right? I mean, people are having fewer kids than ever before today. But you could have pro-fertility days in your town and actually bump those numbers up in your kindergarten grades. You have control over that. So, but there's always, as we know, situations behind which people have their children. So meanwhile, school consolidations happen too. And you go through this list, right? It's mechanized ag. Now we lost the businesses in my town. They all went to the regional centers. Our main streets restructured. Our schools consolidated. Our towns look nothing like they did 100 years ago. You're right. They don't. And the towns even 50 years ago look nothing like they did 50 years before that. So we are continually transforming our communities based upon the environment and the world that we live in. So I would argue, how did we arrive at this time? How did we arrive at a time during which we have such a terrible narrative about our rural communities? There's nobody left. It's all out migration. People prefer living in the cities. We have a drug problem. It's the grain of rural. Like you have all this on one side. You have nothing but problems, and you would think we're dying. But on the other hand, why can't I find a home to buy? Like, if we are dying, I should have plenty of homes for sale. They should be all over the place. And they're not. And why not? Because we're not dying. In fact, we haven't been dying for over 50 years. The rural populations have gone up. So, I like the Mark Twain quote here, like rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated. Like, show me all the dead towns. Like, man, if any one of those trends were going to kill off our towns, we should be littering our landscape with dead towns across the state. We don't have that. It's ridiculous. Rural is changing just like it did 50 years ago, just like it is today. So I did a media study. McKnight had commissioned the Center for Small Towns where I'd worked to look at how the metropolitan media in Minnesota kind of portrayed rural. So we looked at like the topics of the stories and things. And you want to read that, that's at the centerforsmalltowns.org. But one of the things that I did as a part of the study was I would ask reporters like, hey, what time of day did you go to, Clontarf, or what time did you go to DeGraff, or whatever these towns were, right? And the average time of day that I heard most commonly, overwhelmingly, was between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. Well, who are you going to find in most of our smallest towns between 10 and 2? Almost nobody, because the majority of people are now commuting out and working in regional centers or working at home, and they don't have, and meanwhile, right, what happens is a reporter drives up and down Main Street. And there are artifacts of the past, like, oh yeah, there's the boarded up school, there's the boarded up bank, this place is really dying. Like there's nobody here. So what's a reporter do? You go to the cafe, and who do you find in the cafe? All the retired farmers who continue to talk about how life used to be. And I'm not disparaging farmers here. I'm just saying this is kind of a characteristic of how these narratives go. When you only sample, like I'm a survey guy, like when you're only sampling the older population, you're only getting one view of what's going on across this entire community. So let's see, what do you, I know one other thing in the top left corner here. So like more recently, for the past 10 years, our post offices have been threatened with closure. And so one of our major newspapers here in Minnesota, I won't name them, sent a reporter up to Calumet, which is just west of Duluth, up in the northeast part of the state. And they asked, and the reporter, like people love talking to reporters. And, what ends up in the newspaper is a very distilled version of kind of all these quotes that people have and what they get. But the question that the reporter had was, what's going to be the impact of closing this post office on the small town? And let's look at what ended up in the newspaper. So the headline is Iron Range Town Fighting for More Than the Mail. Like, that sounds pretty good, right? And the the byline here is Calumet challenges the decision to close its post office, which is a social hub for its residents. I was like, social hub? Like I never hung out in the post office in Hancock. It was literally, I stared at this and started to laugh, and then I almost started to cry, because it's funny until you think of how many people just read this. How many people now believe that social life is flourishing in our post offices? It's not true. I mean, people are engaged differently today too, and we're going to look at some of these trends. So we've got a lot to get through here today. It's like Smokey and the Bandit. We got a long way to go in a short time to get there, kind of thing here. So there's a lot of data to present, but I'll start with this. The rural population in the U.S. hasn't gone down; it's gone up. It's gone up by 11%. What's gone down is the relative percentage of Americans that live in small towns and rural places. So in 1970, 1 in 4 people lived in rural America, but today it's like 1 in 6, 14%. How can that be? How can the rural population go up, but we have a declining share? It's because while the rural population went up by 11%, the urban population went up by 50%. So the pie got bigger. We have more people. Even the part of the pie that's rural got bigger, but it didn't get as big as fast as as urban places. So this results in a relative percentage decline. But you want to know it's almost always hit on that relative percentage declined from 26% to 14%. And the implication that people take away from this is that people prefer urban living. It's not true. Rural populations got bigger. They just didn't get as big as fast. Sorry about that. And at the same time, many of our rural communities across this country have become urbanized. Sorry, I want to talk about this a little bit more. I didn't put the slide in here, but when I say rural populations grow, they get reclassified. I mean, imagine this, like it used to be in Minnesota here, the 7-county metro area. But I want to go back to 1910, 1920 to look at the inhabitants of Hennepin and Ramsey County. When they live in the core urban area and they were like, oh my gosh, this place is getting too big, I want to move out. What they do, they created the first ring suburbs. Why? Not because they wanted more urban life, it's because they didn't. And then they move out and created the first ring suburbs. And now those suburbs became urbanized. And what happened then, what used to be, 100,000 rural people are now counted as urban. And so it looks like we reduced the number of rural people when in fact it's like urban areas taking over our rural places. So now in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, when people were in Hennepin and Ramsey County and they were saying, I don't want to live here anymore, I want to move out to a less dense rural place. And then they look out to the first ring suburb and they're like, oh my gosh, this place is still urban. So they create the second ring suburbs. And this is called the concentric ring growth around urban around urban areas. And so it overtakes all of these previously rural places and then reclassifies them from rural to urban. So meanwhile, there's a bunch of characteristics that work against us. Now, I'm going to talk about total population infatuation. Like a lot of times we hang our hats on, did our population go up or go down? And I call this the Ricky Bobby approach to population growth right here. Ricky Bobby, if you've seen the movie Talladega Nights, Ricky Bobby is a race car driver. And when he was a child, his father had told him, like, if you ain't first, you're last. And he kind of took that his whole life until later. His dad was like, why do you live by that? That's ridiculous, right? But meanwhile, we do this with our population. Like the new census data comes out, and oh my gosh, our numbers better go up, because if it didn't go up, we're dying or we're stagnant. Like even if your populations remain stable, it's considered stagnant. Like, so I call this the Ricky Bobby approach to population growth. Do not hold your hat too much on total population. And why is that? Because total population doesn't actually tell you how our communities are changing. When you look at how our communities are changing, I'm going to look at this one characteristic that's basically true for all of rural America. And what is it? It is from 1960 to 2010, these 5 counties in Western Minnesota, the population of these counties went down, right? From 69,000 to 45,000, a 35% loss. They're big losers, right? That's typical for the rural narrative, big population losers. Nobody wants to live there anymore. Well, actually, look at the line right below that. The number of occupied households in this region went up by 3.14%. How can that be? How can that be? How can our population go down by 35%, but the number of households go up? It's the average household size has declined. In fact, since 1940, the average household size has declined by a full person. So you are going to lose. And why is that? It's because we have fewer kids. We have more 1- and 2-person households, right? There's all these characteristics that play into that. But if you have a finite number of homes in your town, like when you see a full person household decline, you're going to lose 29% of your population by doing nothing except existing in the modern world. So meanwhile, now we do know the most common situation we have today in our rural communities is 2 seniors in a household, sometimes 1, but we have a lot of 2-person households. And what happens then today when a senior passes away? That senior typically stays in that home. So what happens to our rural population in this situation? Your population just went down by 1, right? Somebody passed away. But that person, though, the surviving spouse, didn't move out. So your households stayed the same. So this is a very common kind of trait that we've got across rural America. Our state demographer, Susan Brower, we call it the slow trickle. It is literally the slow trickle. So it's like it's hard to grow your population when you've got people in a finite number of homes and the households are getting smaller. It's a 2 to 1 person. Like, and if you are infatuated with total population, then we should be like, hey, I know, Jan lost her husband last year, but we got to keep our numbers up. So you don't mind if we have a stranger move into our house, do you? Like, we got to keep our numbers up. There's ridiculous strategies that would come out of this total population infatuation. So meanwhile, a lot of times our narrative is built upon this total population. But when you look across our counties here, there's negative narratives all over the place. Big Stone County lost 9% of your population, but your housing units only went down by 2%. Houston County, my aunt and uncle are on this call right now. Their population went down by 4%. But when you look at the housing units, they went up by 5%. So there's these characteristics of what's going on inside of our households that don't really tell us the full story when we just look at total numbers. So meanwhile, again, negative narrative right down the left column, and like, hey, you might want to check that negative narrative in the right column. So meanwhile, we had found out a number of years ago, 20 years ago, that almost half of Minnesota households move every 5 years. And I was like, man, is that true? So I wanted to look at this. And if you look at any given rural county, you end up with a profile like this, that your population may be relatively stable, not stagnant, right? You can be stable without it being negative. So a stable population. But what happened in Grant County is when you see the bars go to the left here, this is the brain drain. They lost 43% of the young people after graduation over this 10-year time period from 1990. This was like the very first chart I made. So from 1990 to 2000, they lost 43% of the young people. And I was like, oh yeah, that's the brain drain, right? But what about this? What about all these 30s, 40s, 50s moving in and 10 to 14-year-olds? And they're not moving by themselves. They're coming with their parents. So ultimately, the story of Grant County, Minnesota, is that they brought in enough people to make up for the outflow of the brain drain. And maybe, just maybe, we should be interested in finding out who are these people, right? But meanwhile, I look at all the books and all the literature around me, and what did I find? Almost nothing. Because all we look at are the negatives. It was ridiculous. So I see it in footnotes like, oh, apparently there's a rise in 30 to 40-year-olds in the prime earning years in rural America. Like, isn't that the headline? That's not a footnote. So meanwhile, we do studies of newcomers, and we have the latest one that we've done was in 2019. Montana replicated our survey in 2021. And when we asked newcomers, why did you move to this rural community? And the top three reasons that people give were, number one was a simpler pace of life. Get access to recreation, outdoors, getting away from a commute. It was both push and pull factors related to the simpler pace of life. Number two was safety and security, especially high with people with children. And the third top reason that we heard was the low cost of housing. Now, nowhere in the top 10 was a job. Now, that doesn't mean people don't need a job, but it just means that people don't move just because of a job. I mean, it makes sense, right? But if you were in 1920, it is a residential move for an employment opportunity. But today, there's been a decoupling of where you live and where you work. In fact, if we were to poll people on this call, like how many of you live in the county you work in? Like it's going to be low. And I know this because we've done some research on this. We'll share in just a minute. So what we had found is, who are these newcomers? Just 41% move for a job. Essentially, I mean, they have to get a job, right, eventually, but that's not how they make their residential choice. So the other, and that's for 60%, but for these 40%, some did have job offers that they took, and that's what drove their move to the region. It still didn't necessarily decide their move to which community they ended up in. One very important point here I want to hit on is just 25% of the new residents of new resident households are from your community. I think we tend to look at like, oh, Rick, your son moved back. You know, you're a common name. I recognize his face, right? If that's a returnee, right? He moved away and he came back. Well, that's just 1 in 4 people. I want to remind you that 3 out of 4 households moving into your community are not from there. So imagine what kind of experience, and we already know this, right? It's anxiety ridden. It's like, you hope it's going to go well, but you don't know anybody. And how do you feel connected? And like, you're moving there for hope and opportunity, right? It's great. People love our small towns. But just 25% have lived there before. So how do we actually know who these people are? I mean, right now it's dark when you get up in the morning and dark when you get home. You wouldn't know if somebody moved in across the street or down the street until the spring. And then you're like, oh, what happened to John? I thought he was living in that house. Like, right? We don't have opportunities for social engagement like we used to. We need to actually be explicit and reach out very explicitly to these people. It's harder to find them, but when you want to find them, you can find them. You really can. We had found just 47% of these newcomer households have children. So, you know, imagine every time there's a newcomer household with kids, which, you know, I got kids and there's a new kid in my kid's class and there's their parent, like they're easy to see, right? But I'll remind you, every time there's a newcomer household with children now, there's going to be another newcomer household that doesn't have kids. And how welcomed are they? Are they truly integrated, involved, welcome to this town as well? And we had found 14% of respondents and 20% of respondent households were telecommuting in some way. And this is the year before the pandemic. So then Montana replicated our survey a year into the pandemic. And what we found out is the percentage of people who had lived in the community before went up from 1 in 4 people now to 1 in 3. And we kind of speculate here that, and we've done, I met up with a bunch of assessors during the pandemic too, and we had found out like, home sales during the pandemic were wonky. And a lot of times they were not arm's length transactions. It was like, hey, Rick, I know your mom is looking to sell her house. We've always loved her house. We're just going to take you out for a meal and get it done. This is how social arrangements can help dictate your housing transitions. Because what we had found today is if you don't have an in to your housing stocks, how do you welcome anybody new in? Again, our homes are filled. The negative narrative tells us there's nobody living here and there should be homes everywhere, but there's not, and you know this. So what does this look like then? How do you find a house during the pandemic? You have to know somebody. So we kind of comically say, like, you want to find a home to buy in rural America, go visit with your seniors after church. You will find out right away what's on the radar, what's coming. So if you're an employer in a rural community, and I would argue a lot of times we don't have a labor shortage if you don't have a pay shortage. Like if you really have a labor shortage, a lot of times it's not a labor shortage, it's a housing shortage. Because it is almost impossible. I worked with the National Rural Education Association, and they've got a website to help people in the education sector get jobs, superintendents or teachers or whatever. And that's great. Well, let's look for a job. And then it's like, oh, there's a job in Hancock. And then we go to realtor.com and there's nothing for sale. So it's like, oh, well, I'll go on to the next job, right? And it is kind of like that. It is the housing stocks are limiting supply to change right now in our rural communities. So I'm going to call this the brain gain, right? On one hand, I'm not going to call this a brain drain. Why would we even have a headline around the brain drain? What are you losing your high school kids with like a high school education, very little work experience, social connections, social capital, all that. So I don't want to compare the two, but let's compare the two, right? The 18-year-old with the 30 to 40-year-old who are in their prime earning years, may half of them have kids, right? That career, they're telecommuting, they're bringing everything with them to their rural communities. Their work experience, their passion for involvement, engagement, right? They are engaged. They tend to lead more than the resident population. They tend to donate more than the resident population. These folks are not coming in to disrupt our communities. They're coming in because they love your towns, folks. They really do. So meanwhile, I'm going to call this brain gain. And when I first published this in 2002, everybody was like, wow, this is new, right? And as if like the 90s, it just happened in the 90s. I was like, well, actually, if you look back on the data, this has been happening since the 70s. So my real question is, why has nobody really noticed this? Why are we not talking about this more? The fact that we're not dying, and what is, our strategies change significantly when we're not dying. And these newcomers moving in have diversified our rural economy. I am a non-agricultural rural sociologist. I am here to represent the 95% of rural Americans who are not engaged in ag or an ag-related field. Because a lot of times when I talk to people about, hey, if I talk to an urbanite, right? Like, hey, would you think about moving to a rural area? And they're like, I'm not a farmer. It's like, oh, yeah, but no, we've got so many other jobs, right? And even in farming, even in agriculture, it's high tech, high precision ag. So we did this study at University of Minnesota Extension that showed you're right. You're right. Any one town in rural Minnesota is not going to have a diverse economy, as if we're comparing Hancock to Minneapolis, St. Paul regional like metro area. But when you put 3 to 5 counties together, and more importantly, what we showed is there is every occupation and every job in rural America and rural Minnesota. It's just not everywhere. You need to get out to find it, right? So even when you put 3 to 5 to 7 counties together, you've got a very diverse economy. So if you're really parochial in the sense that, I lived in Hancock, oh, everybody's got to live here, right? Well, if all you're talking about is Hancock, you're going to miss the fact that, if, hey, Rick, you want to move in, you're an electrical engineer? Sorry, we don't have any jobs in Hancock. But if you know your region, you're like, oh, we have one in Benson. We have a whole engineering firm down there. So, but this is where you've got to know more than just your community. We need to get out of our parochialism of a time during which these jurisdictions seem to matter more than our lives. So power is very interesting. So meanwhile, we did this study around resident recruitment. And part of this is when I had analyzed the data of the percentage of people that both that work in the county that they live in. You found out that just 51% of people in Minnesota work in the county they live in. Like 49% are commuting out every day. And so here's, for example, Pine County, every day, 3,200 people commute in. Every day, 200 people commute out. And just of those, 5,100 people both live and work in the community. This is true everywhere, right? But I want to remind you that these county boundaries were drawn during a time of horse and buggy. They don't reflect how we live. We're trying to make decisions in them and have power systems in place, but they don't really mean anything in terms of how people live their lives. Like there isn't a random kind of boundary for Pine County. You got a river and some other like natural geographies around it. But ultimately, how do you make decisions in these jurisdictions when it doesn't reflect how people actually live? So at the same time, when I would present this data early on, I'd be like, hey, you got all these new people moving in. I would get told, well, where are they? They're not part of my groups. What are they doing? They don't really care about this community. I'd be like, oh, you better watch that language because they actually do. And you're right. They're not involved in your groups. They're involved in theirs. And you don't know where they're spending their time. So you have to be real careful about this kind of negative cross language that happens across our rural communities. So what we do know is the National Center for Charitable Statistics has a really awesome database. Like, say it with me, awesome database, right? Awesome database about the number of nonprofits by county. It gives you a list of all the nonprofits, what sector they're in, what type of activities they do, their revenue, their assets. Like for me, it's a gold mine of information. And my point here is social life is not dying. And how do I know that? It's because the number of nonprofits in this country goes up by 5 to 15% every 5 years. This is huge. Nonprofits are reflections of social life. We create nonprofits to reflect our interests and our support and what we want to do. We don't have groups that just plant themselves in from the outside, be like, hey, you're going to take, senior veterans fishing. Like, no, that's a person who's like, hey, I want to make sure our senior veterans are able to go fishing. Right. And we do. We've got people here in central Minnesota that do that with fishing in Minnesota. But you actually have people that have an interest. So I like to look at our nonprofit sectors because it reflects who we are. We create nonprofits as a reflection of what we are and who we are as an expression of our values. So when we look at social life, so my whole point here is social life is not dying either. Like nonprofits continue to go up. Minnesota population in the last 10 years went up by 9%, but the number of nonprofits went up by 16%. But meanwhile, we have this kind of crosstalk about the young people. They don't care about this community. They're so selfish, right? Even today, you talk about millennials are selfish and entitled. And like nothing is going to make the hair raise on the back of my neck more. This is like some of the most debilitating negative language you can promote in your community. Because I will remind you all, especially, baby boomers, you were called selfish and entitled too when you were kids. And now we're just repeating this vicious cycle. So meanwhile, what we do, you look at the covers, all these magazines, right? It's like selfish, 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 selfish. Decade after decade, we call these young people selfish. But ultimately, being selfish is not a characteristic of a generation. It's a characteristic of your age, right? You're 18 to 25-year-old. You're going to be selfish. You've got to find out who you are. You're going to find your spouse or partner and some kind of career or go to school and find out your path in life. Like, we got to be okay with selfishness and stop this negative narrative that's happening. So meanwhile, what has happened in our rural communities, there's been a big shift in terms of how people get engaged and involved. So historically, people would be involved in kind of place-based groups with a broad focus. And it could be the Hancock Community Betterment Club. And it did anything in town, from raising money for the playground or helping the school or helping rebuild the church or whatever it was. Broad focus, narrow geography. It didn't help out Morris. It only helped out Hancock, right? It was just Hancock. People today want to be involved in just the opposite on both axes. So rather than a narrow geography, it's a broad geography. Rather than a broad focus, it's a narrow focus. We have the West Central Minnesota Snowmobile Association or Bicycle Association or whatever. We've got these regional recreation arts groups, all of these things that express themselves across our rural communities. So this has been the big shift. So meanwhile, when I get people in town talking about how these people don't care about my community because they're not showing up at my meeting. Yeah, they're in their meetings right here. And we tend to have these two crosstalk with one another all the time and not really work well together. So we actually advocate an extension. We do bridging programs. We're trying to bring people, we're trying to bring groups together and recognize that, again, you go back to that stereotype that you know everybody in your small town. You don't. You may know of 20, 30% of the people in your community, and how many do you really know well? A vastly smaller proportion of that. So it's interesting to see how this kind of narrative crosstalk happens by local leaders and the new people who are never seen, for example. So even when we look at what types of nonprofits we have and how we express ourselves in this social way, we see in Minnesota the composition of the NTEE. It's like a classification of types of nonprofits. We see religion related as number one, and that's number one for almost every state in the country. Number two in Minnesota is recreation, sports, leisure, educational institutions, number three. And you see the types of groups is varied. And when we look at the type, so then I wanted to respond to a lot of folks like, well, you know what, we've had these nonprofit groups in town for so long, people just need to learn how we do it around here. It's like, that sounds kind of bad, right? Like, learn how to do it around here. Like, I get that, but we're treating people like warm bodies. I call this a warm body approach to our new residents. It's a lot of times like, oh, Ben, you're new in town. Are you ready to join the EDA board? It's like, you don't know who I am. Why would you even think that's a good idea, right? So, got to be real careful that when we have new people in town, that we're not just having an expectation that they get involved in ways that we're involved, without taking the time to actually acknowledge where they are. And how do we know they're involved? Because in the last 30 years, 30% of all Minnesota 56% of all Minnesota nonprofits were created just in the past 30 years. So this idea that we've got some antiquated social life in our rural communities that we just need to learn how to operate in is dated. It's not even true. When we look at the types of nonprofits that have grown in the past 30 years, they're recreation, sports, leisure, educational institution, and that can be like It could be either parent-led groups, it could be student support groups, student activity groups. There's a lot of groups that get created around education. And then we got arts, culture, and humanities. And I'd like to think that, here in Minnesota, we've got that legacy amendment, right? Which almost no other state has. And we've got dedicated general fund spending going toward recreation, arts, culture, and humanities. So it's interesting. I haven't done this study, but it's kind of interesting to see, like, to what extent do we see growth in these nonprofit sectors as a result of this kind of legacy funding and through the legacy amendment. So this is very diverse too, but I did a study last year that showed that there are differences in nonprofits between rural and urban America. And here in Minnesota, if you live in the most urban counties, Hennepin and Ramsey County, 1 in 26 people need to be involved as a leader in our nonprofit sector. But in our rural communities, our most rural communities, 1 in 9 people have to serve as a nonprofit leader across rural Minnesota. And that is a huge demand for leadership. So you want to find out more about leadership. March 15th is the next webinar. We're going to dig real deep into all of these kind of social activities and how people get engaged and involved. But with that, I'm just going to step away from this. So like, how do you get people engaged? Like, new residents are more than warm bodies. A lot of times these younger residents, like, they want to be involved. They just don't want to be involved in like some centralized command and control system about, we've got committees and then there's subcommittees and like, oh my gosh. It is overwhelming for new people to come into a meeting and hear nothing but Robert's Rules of Order. And I think we need to work harder at finding ways to make sure that the younger people, and when I say younger, I mean under 40, younger people moving into our rural communities actually have legitimate ways to feel seen and supported. So we're going to get way in depth onto these topics here more, but so this was a chart that shows, and the date is right above me here in the corner. No, above this shoulder? No, over there, 2009. And this was the Pew Research Center. They did the study in 2009, and Pew's very popular. They do all these opinion studies across the US. You've probably heard of them. But in 2009, they said, all right, Americans, we know that 80% of you live in the city and 20% of you live in the country. But if you could live wherever you wanted, where would you live? Where would you live? Right. And what happened? 51% of Americans said they'd prefer to live in small towns and rural places. And why don't they? I think on one hand, our narrative is so negative, they think they never could. Right. I'm not a farmer. I don't like to hang out in the post office. All of these things kind of play into this. Like, what kind of story are we really telling about what's going on across our rural communities? So now, I just want to kind of turn that narrative on its head, like the living in the middle of nowhere. Like, man, you live in the middle of everywhere. So we do this exercise and extension that have people identify and delineate, just imagine this, put an X where you live and then put a star where you work. And it's maybe not the same town, right? And then think about how far in the past year did you go out to shop and eat out? And it's like, well, when we lived in Hancock, we would go up to like Fergus and over to Sauk Center and St. Cloud and Wilmer was our target shopping trip, right? It was like, that was our region. And so what you end up expressing through this exercise is that people really do live in the middle of everywhere. Our town isn't going to have it all. When we lived in Hancock, I did not want to eat at Buddy's Bar and Grill every time we ate out. I wanted to eat at the Mexican restaurant in Benson. We have places out in the country that had restaurants too. This is how we live. So we have to get over, I can't say this enough, right? Get over our parochialism around our city and our county boundaries because it doesn't reflect how people actually live. And that how do we live? We live in the middle of everywhere, and these boundaries are huge. So there actually is a national societal preference to live in small towns and rural places. These low dense areas, it's been expressed for over 70 years now. People are moving to small towns. The trend in the 70s that really took off, we call it the rural rebound or rural renaissance. And during this time period of the 70s, 2.2 million more people moved from the city to the country than vice versa. So what I've seen now, in my view, is since the 70s, we've had this brain gain. People moved in. The brain gain really took off in the 90s. It filled up almost all of our vacant homes, where in the 2000s now, we know we've been talking about this like grain of rural. We have a large proportion of people who are older. And what does that look like, right? And we used to, like 15 years ago, we're like, yep, we're grain. And that what's going to happen in the next 20 years, right? When people that are grain are now dying, right? We have to be explicit about this. I've got a whole nother housing presentation to do too. But this is very interesting what happens when this entire population is going to be moving out or moving on. What does that look like? So What kind of narrative do you have in your town? Because I'll tell you that the number one audience for a negative narrative are your kids. So these are my kids, Calvin and Truman, and they are going to be the first ones to hear, as kids do in our small towns today, that there is nothing here for you. Our best days are behind us. You need to get out to succeed. That's not a good narrative. It's also not accurate. No way are your kids ever going to come back if they're told this story. So we've got kids, I work with school districts all the time. We've got kids living in negative narrative households all the time, and they don't have an alternative narrative presented in front of them about what this community is or where they are, or how much people love it, or who's moving in. So maybe be explicit about sharing these stories around newcomers within your community, and especially letting your children and your young people hear these stories so they know that if they chose to move back, they are not going to be considered a failure. So be a bridge, right, to people in the community. Be a stable connection between the old and the new, because a lot of times I hear like the older population, like, when are these people going to learn about our culture? And then the new people moving in are like, what? I can't even figure out how to get my stuff hooked up right now. Like, you end up having a discontinuous journey that newcomers have to our small towns. So we want to welcome people in. We need to reach out, and people will come to appreciate our historical time and the nature of this place, but they also want to add their flavor to this community too. So change is coming. This was a data point from 10 years ago, and that was 30% of our homeowners are over the age of 70, and another 45% are baby boomers. 75% of our rural homes are owned by people 75% are owned by people that are baby boomers and older. Now think about this. 3/4 of our households are occupied by people that tend to not have kids. Like the younger baby boomers might still have kids yet, but overall, like this over 70-year-olds don't have kids in their household. So imagine now, imagine you have a finite number of homes. 3/4 of those homes are occupied by people over the age that are baby boomers and older, and they're going to turn over. 75% of our homes are going to turn over in the next 25 years. And this is unprecedented. So really, like I mentioned, like this was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, this data point is true. What's happened? Like what's going on? We should be changing quicker. Why are things not changing quicker? Why do we have a labor shortage? Why do we have a housing shortage? Here is my answer. Historically, in the past, once people hit the age of, where is this? I'm going to move myself around here. 67, 68, 69. They would move out of home ownership. This is the home ownership rate on the left, right? So from 65 to 95%. We know a lot of people, they own homes. But what happened in the past, all previous generations, once they hit the age of 67, would start to move out of home ownership, right? And what happens when you move out of a home? That opens up that home for somebody to move in, right? And they're bringing their household in to be a laborer, to contribute to the economy, to be a part of nonprofits, like all these things. But today, people today, this generation of seniors in our homes today is the blue line. They're staying in their homes. They are not moving out. So what happens when people don't move out? You can't welcome anybody new in. So what's the difference between those lines there? Those are all the lost opportunities for in-migrants, to be honest. And I would argue, and I do, people call me the person who's trying to kick our seniors out of our homes, because ultimately this senior population, they're in our 4-bedroom, 2-bath family housing. They legit are. And right now we have the wrong people in the wrong homes. But what's the story? Local employers saying, I have a labor shortage. It's not a labor shortage. Your laborers can't find a home to buy anywhere, right? And this has happened. So essentially what happened was the Great Retirement. Great Retirement happens when all the people who are older just retire and stay in their home. So how can our local labor force become substituted when that retirement happens if no home becomes available? This is my number one sticking point, is the churn of housing. 58% of older adults have not changed residence in more than 20 years. This is unprecedented, folks. So what we do know is we have seen success around building patio homes and independent living. And when I say older population here, I do not mean people moving into assisted living. I'm not talking about continuum of care. I'm talking about continuum of life, post-retirement, continuum of life, before you get to continuum of care. What residential choices do you have? So meanwhile, we've got age in place strategies. We spend billions of dollars keeping people in our homes, which is actually, for me, the number one inhibitive factor preventing us from welcoming in new residents, new labor, from anything changing. It's inhibited because our housing stocks are stopped up. So these newcomers are creating groups. They're building their community. I mean, ultimately, people are making the choice to move to our small towns. They're not being like forced to, right? Move there and choosing to move to our small towns. And they're creating their groups. They're diversifying the economy. They're buying and starting businesses. And this is important too. We've got like 56% of our business owners in rural America today are looking to retire in the next 10 to 15 years. And if the narrative in your town is that we're dying, who's going to buy your dying business? Like, why would I buy your grocery store? You're dying, right? Like, we're not. Like, in fact, so think about this, what this will look like. They're buying and starting businesses. People are living in a region. They're more than warm bodies. So the bottom line is people want to live and move to your towns for what you are today and will be tomorrow, not what may have been. So in fact, when I've done these interviews and focus groups, if you do have a negative narrative, I'll just remind you that nobody I've ever interviewed had said they're moving to your town for pity. Like, oh, Hancock, I feel real bad. You lost your grocery store 23 years ago. I'm going to move in today to help you out. Like, nobody cares. To be honest, nobody cares what happened last year in some of these towns. People still see good things. So whenever I present this, like, I will advocate for you to go out and find a new resident. Find somebody who's moved to your region in the past 5 years and listen to their narrative about what they're talking about your place, because it can be refreshing to hear the narrative that's being told as we move our communities forward. So there's my email there. If you've got any questions, please feel free to email me. I think we've got time for some questions here. I'm kind of ending early somewhat. I've always got a lot to say, so we will see. But yeah, Rick, have we got any questions you want to kind of bring forward for me here?
Yeah, couple of things. One comment here is talking about the housing. It would be that the fact that the baby boomers own record number of second homes.
So okay, yeah.
So respond.
So second home ownership is not new. In fact, like in Aiken County, like 60% of all the housing units in Aiken County are recreational. They're not full-time occupied residents. But we did research that showed 54% of second homeowners plan to retire to their second home, and they are. So what does this mean for community development, right? So meanwhile, the narrative in our lake towns is that the lake people are only here on the weekend. They don't care about this community, blah, 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 right? Not blah, blah. But right, so you've got a negative narrative about the lake people or the visiting people. But then when those lake people actually move up there, what's the narrative I hear from them? I'm never invited to anything. They don't even care about me around here. They don't even consider it a resident. So it's not just buying up all those lake homes. We haven't seen a massive transition over. The biggest change we saw on the recreational side was probably 25, 30 years ago, and we saw a lot of resorts get kind of parted out into individual properties. But our housing units on the recreational side have been very stable. We're starting to see those transitions turning over. We started to see it already in the latest census, given the issues with the data. We have seen transitions happen, that we are seeing the recreational property numbers go down because they are turning those recreational properties into their primary residence. So I don't know if that's the answer you're looking for, but that's what I have learned about movers around recreational properties.
And one of the other requests was, you mentioned that you're doing a housing webinar soon.
We are just in the planning for that right now. I don't have the date set, but if you're interested, shoot me an email, or maybe we'll talk to Karen. I mean, you may be offering this again in the fall. I did it last fall too, but we're just in the planning process right now.
Okay. And I did put into the chat the link to the housing, or to all the webinars that are being offered. And in a moment, we'll put in the link to the evaluation, which is where if you're a U of M employee and looking for the 200 points, that's where you have to fill out the evaluation and request them towards the end of that. Let's go back. Anyone else?
I see a question here.
Okay.
I see a question here. Why isn't there more new home construction growing small towns? There are no developers, to be honest. Right now, the developers in the very high margin of error, high margin areas. Housing doesn't get built where there's desire. Housing gets built where there's income. It's really that simple. So in terms of family housing, but we have seen, like, for example, Otter Tail County, the Tri-City Cooperatives, they've got a group up there. We've actually, I mean, Otter Tail County's got a goal of building 5,000 homes right now based upon a lot of this research that we're doing. So it is the biggest avenues of growth we've seen locally has not been around hoping a developer comes in from the outside. It is building patio homes. They did this up in Otter Tail, the small town of Otter Tail in Otter Tail County. I talked to the developer there. He had, I just don't think a lot of developers know this data around the seniors stopping up that supply, and the fact that the real solution that we see is not building more workforce housing, because that's where our seniors currently are. It's building patio homes, independent living, so they can go visit the kids for 3 weeks. I mean, there's all of this is such a deep trend. So essentially, my point is, I do not look to developers to build family housing. They're not there. They're high margin areas. I mean, there's a kind of pathway for young people to know, like, you want to go into construction, man, it's booming, like plumbing, electrical, any of this work. Like, you want to be a tradesperson, like, now is the best time to do it. But there is a shortage, solely because there are not that many that do that housing development, and they're not attracted to doing like middle margin rural development projects. So that's kind of my take on it.
And let's take a back look through. There will be a recording. Everyone will get an email in the next few days with a link to the PowerPoint, if Ben will send that. And then at some point, the recording will be put online and be made available to everyone. It does take some time for them to edit the recordings. And that is the link that I put into the chat. You can get to that for filling out the evaluation, and you'll get a link follow-up email in about 30 days.
I see another message here. Should migrants be encouraged to move to small rural towns? They may want to be farmers and create businesses. Rural communities are in high demand. So it still, for me, comes down to how do you even get housing for people that you're trying to invite in? You can't just like put up a welcome sign and everybody's just like, where am I supposed to live? It really is that simple at this point. So yes, they have been. We've seen like Farm Beginnings program work wonders at really helping new people become farmers, even with the high capital costs around that. But again, you want to know more about ag and farming, you're going to have to ask those folks. They are literally the experts on that side. Yeah, Corey Heppola has a film series called Rural by Choice that, so Otter Tail County, they've actually ran with this rural rebound ball, this whole rural narrative brain gain stuff. They hired the nation's first Rural Rebound Initiative Coordinator. Eric Osberg is his name. It's the only person in the world that's got this job that I know of. And it is his job to help rewrite this narrative through tourism, economic development. So Corey Heppola is with KSTP, and they created this webinar series. It could easily be on television, but it's very good. Corey Heppola is originally from Otter Tail County. He's kind of producing this reflective piece about, is it like I remembered, am I misremembering, what I thought was bad is now like, oh my gosh, it's not bad at all. So it's a very interesting series to kind of spin the narrative back on its head. Really thankful to have him doing this.
Gary points out or says that finding lower income housing in rural Minnesota is impossible. Makes it hard to get the job there.
Yeah, well, then the jobs have to pay more. I mean, ultimately, we're going to see a restabilization across our economy and the housing thing. I mean, before the pandemic, it was actually, we were seeing wages because we are, in a tight labor market. I'm a rural sociologist. I'm like, I like to see the power that labor has and the influences on wages. And we've had this labor shortage, not just for the past 3 or 4 years. I mean, we had this labor shortage for 15 years in rural America. So we've been seeing the wages rise. And, there's that data point around you shouldn't spend on housing burdened, right? You shouldn't spend more than 30% of your income on your housing and housing related costs. And we started to see that actually go down all the way up until the pandemic. So, as wages went up, what had been stagnant wages were going up to the point that people were paying a smaller proportion of their income on that housing piece because the wages were going up finally. But then the pandemic hit and it just exacerbated home values because rural people, because everybody was like, hey, I could live in a rural place. And all it did was shone a light on the already high demand for rural America. So what happens again? This is what happened is when our housing stocks weren't empty, they were full. So the few homes we did go for sale, it just exacerbated those home values. So now all the gains we had made on the income side are now being taken away because of the increase in the home values. So we start to, I mean, everything's still working itself out. And I still think there's a lot of work to be done on the wage side. Once our businesses truly work in a new wage level, which they're going to have to do that, we will see what remains in our industries.
And I think you were kind of responding to Jason's question here, but have you noticed any significant continuation in the trend of people relocating to more rural communities as remote workers?
Oh yeah, I mean, 20% of our newcomer households were telecommuting, and that was before the pandemic. So I think now the numbers are only going to go up. Again, when I go back to that data point of 75% of your people are baby boomers and older, they're just shifting right out of the workforce. So when I look at the substitutions, what's going to happen when you go out with a senior household, 1 to 2 person senior household, and in with a 3 to 5 person 30 to 50-year-old household, driven household, right? And again, if 20% of those are telecommuting, we need to be building this infrastructure for remote work in our rural communities. We have got broadband. Like when I was in Hancock, we had fiber to the farm in broadband. And why is that? Because we had cooperatives that put fiber everywhere. Rural areas that do not have a cooperative are reliant upon the private industry, which may not make that investment, right? And when we looked at even electricity and phones, they were not too attractive for rural areas either by the private sector. And we had to create all these cooperatives to do the work. So again, I go back to the narrative. If the narrative is negative, people think they never could be a remote worker. Like, I just can't move to Hancock. I'm a remote worker. Like, oh, did you know we have gig, synchronous gig? Internet there? They had fiber laid to the farm 18 years ago, folks. So the narrative around the digital divide, we have to be real careful. There are rural places that don't have internet. That's very good. But at the same time, we've got faster internet. I moved to St. Cloud. My internet got slower, significantly slower when I went from Hancock to St. Cloud. It was like going to dial-up, folks. It was like, remember in the days of dial-up when you had to download some big file or whatever, and you would start the download at night and then you would go to bed. My upload went to something so small here. It was like that. It was like, boy, I hope it doesn't break overnight and I got to redo it in the morning or whatever. You'd have download managers and all this, right? This is the story, is we actually have really great broadband across many of our rural communities. So the other side of this is, do our local employers know how to manage remote workers? I think this is the more pertinent and relevant question about our workforce, is we may have people who may be very astute, but our managers just don't want to do it. We saw a lot of resistance during the pandemic around trying to bring people back to the office, just because I believe managers were realizing that they didn't need as many managers as they really have. So then, got to get people back so I can oversee them potentially, right? So I think that's been the number one. You think about labor, managers, and owners, the number one resistive audience is managers to remote work. The people want to do it. The owners want to reduce all the transaction costs. So it was kind of interesting to see where the pushes come on remote work. So that's my point, is we can help build the skills just like we did 25 years ago when we offered training on how to use PowerPoint and Word and Excel. Today it is, how do you manage a remote worker? What are metrics in place in Microsoft Teams? You have all these things. It's just we need to increase our literacy around that. So great question. I love it. It is. We are going to continue that. We're not going backwards in our economy anytime soon. We're going to have more and more knowledge workers with the ability to do their work remotely. So good question. We're building for the future here.
And one last question before we run out of time. Beyond the social aspects, what roles do the nonprofits play, particularly in addressing housing needs?
Well, I'm not sure specifically about the housing needs, but we know the nonprofit sector is the third largest employer in the country. The nonprofit sector is the number one buffer during a time of a recession. The research is real clear that communities, like everybody goes through a recession, but the communities that came out of that quicker had more nonprofits per capita. They had more giving. They had more people engaged and involved. And in the upper Midwest, we're actually rife with all these people wanting to be engaged and involved. Our social capital is like through the roof here in Minnesota. And I think if you don't leave the state, you don't know how good we have it. You don't know, our home ownership rates are through the roof. Educational achievement for many of our groups, still not for all groups, is higher than the rest of the country. We've got all these metrics around voting, right? Public participation, all of these metrics around social engagement that, like, for example, when I went to school in Missouri, like, it was non-existent. The idea that the nonprofit sector was going to be there to help people. When I was in Brazil, it was even more so. The idea that if they, like, for example, on the other extreme, in Brazil, I was meeting with all these small group representatives, and they're like, how do we get this park built in town? And I, as a community developer, was like, mobilize people and then start doing fundraising and all this. And their only strategy was, how do we get the government to build the park? Not that we could ever do it ourselves. So I think there's this whole continuum of how we expect people to be kind of engaged and involved. So for us, having a very strong social network and social system is a protection against recession. It brings us back, it protects us against it, and it brings us back quicker. And I don't think many people actually know the impact that the nonprofit sector has on the nation as a whole, but even to the extent to which we rely upon it to build our communities. So there is you'll get a copy of the PowerPoint here, and you'll see on one of those slides, it's the article I'd written was, how many people do we need to run our towns? And it is, how many council people, how many county commissioners, how many nonprofit leaders do we need? And this is our buffer. This is how we come out of these problems. So.
Okay, well, thank you, Ben. We've run just a minute or two over. I appreciate your time, and thank you for presenting this information. A lot of positive comments in the chat.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out. Please feel free to reach out to me if you've got any questions in the future.